Long Distance is a short essayistic personal documentary completed in 2017. It developed out of a situation in my personal life, a situation very much shaped by its social and political context. In 2010, I'd been in a kind of romantic relationship with an American man called Kenneth for 5 years. And at that point, there was no way to formalize our relationship that would secure me the right to reside in the United States. My kind of legal right to stay in the States had lapsed during the course of the relationship. And with my return to the UK, the partnership became more difficult, as you can imagine. During one of my visits back to California, Kenneth and I decided to end the relationship, which was under quite a lot of strain. We made the decision during a long-distance train journey from San Francisco to Chicago. In the years following the end of the relationship, I became increasingly conscious of the role that the legal status of gay relationships had had on the demise of the relationship. And I felt that it should be represented in a film piece. As I mentioned, the relationship had been ended during a long-distance train journey from San Francisco to Chicago. I documented this journey with kind of casual snaps, which had not been intended to be a part of any kind of creative project. And it seemed to me that the images taken during this journey could form the basis of a film telling the story of the end of this relationship. Images taken on board the train could be the basis for a telling of the relationship and the end of the relationship, while images taken through the windows of the landscape could form the basis of a meditation on American society. And it seemed to me there was a confrontation between America out there in the landscape and the relationship inside the train. So I'll just show a few minutes of the beginning of the film. Okay, so that's the opening of the film. After scanning the negatives, these kind of casual snaps, the sequencing of the images was the first kind of question. I needed to decide how long each still image should be held on the screen, how I would transition between them. The breakup of the relationship was obviously not explicitly, not directly represented in the images. Therefore, I needed a voiceover to describe it, and the voiceover could also describe the political context. In terms of a literary treatment of the voiceover, I faced a number of creative decisions. Firstly, the point of view, the position of enunciation. Should I write and speak the voiceover in the first person as myself, or should I craft a third person voiceover and tell the story from the position of someone outside the relationship? A more removed point of view had the appeal of seeming less self-indulgent, less exposed. However, as the narrative of the film is a personal one concerning a private relationship, a voiceover written from outside the relationship might be incongruous. Indeed, a third-person voiceover might also be incongruous with the still images. The images often, though not always, have a strongly subjective first-person sense to them. They often contain indications of the photographer's position, my position, within the space of the train. For example, when the frame of the window is visible. As such, a third-person voiceover would be incongruous with those first-person images. So the first kind of question, point of view, the position of enunciation of the voiceover. Secondly, the address of the narration. To whom should I speak? To whom should the voiceover be directed? Should I address an individual? Should I address the audience? If so, how explicit should this address be? I decided to address the text to my ex-partner as though the film was some kind of letter or message to him. The voiceover begins, as you heard. So I wanted to make a film about the end of our relationship. When we met, you lived in San Francisco. So the you is, of course, my ex-partner. In this, I'm reminded of Laura Rascaroli's characterization of first-person essayistic cinematic forms, such as diary or self-portrait films. She writes, in general, and unlike the essay, these forms do not seek a one-to-one dialogue with an embodied spectator, but fashion themselves as private monologues, or better, dialogues with the self, or with an intimate partner, and thus only allow the spectator in as an overseeing and overhearing third party. However, this monologic, self-centered structure always hides a dialogical attitude, which seeks the relationship with an audience. So the voiceover to long distance matches Rascaroli's description here. Addressed to my ex-partner, it creates a sense of dialogue with an intimate partner. However, as Rascaroli suggests, this is complicated by an implicit address to the audience. Indeed, the narration's ubiquitous you sometimes generates, I believe, a strange confusion, moments in which the audience feels as though they are in the position of the you addressed by the voiceover, which supposedly is my partner. Similarly, the first person plural, the occasional we of the voiceover, is sometimes ambiguous, seeming to address my partner, but also to describe a shared situation for the benefit of an audience. So a third kind of question in terms of this narration, tense and temporality. Would I speak in the present tense, in the moment of the events? Or would I speak in the past tense, describing events from a position later in time, after the events, looking back? Speaking in the past tense from a point of view after the end of the relationship was, I felt, more authentic, as the voiceover was actually written in or from this kind of position in time. There's some complexity to the film, I think, in this area because of the temporal treatment. We might suggest that the voiceover is autobiographical in that it describes retrospectively a series of events from a point of view after they have ended, while the images are diaristic, recording the journey as it occurs and presenting a sense of the immediate present or now. Diction was a further area of consideration. What type of language should I use? How concrete, poetic, or abstract should the language be? What should the balance be between narrative summary, dramatic treatment, or visual description of the appearance of events? Sometimes I feel the images resist the kind of poetic metaphor or the attempt at poetic metaphor of the voiceover. Tone, another area of consideration. What should the emotional kind of feeling of the voiceover be? The wintry images have a desolate mood to them. The situation portrayed is bleak. Sometimes the voiceover chimes with this. At other points, dark humor sits at counterpoint to the image. Exposition, a further kind of question in the writing of this voiceover. I needed to decide how much contextual information I'd provide about the legal status of gay relationships in the United States, background information about the central relationship, and so on. How much would I include? How could this be elegantly incorporated? And where in the film would it be placed? In general, I chose to avoid including a great deal of expository information in the voiceover, as I felt this would dissipate the lyricism of the piece in both image and narration. After an early screening, I added a little on-screen text to clarify the context without disturbing the voiceover in itself. Pace and rhythm.
Richard, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Unfortunately, we can only see the first slide. We haven't. Have you been moving through the slides?
Yeah, I have. Can you see any more there?
No. I think sometimes when you share the screen, it gives... Oh, there we go. That's wonderful. Okay, now it's coming through. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay, sorry. You've missed quite a lot of... Can you see this one? Tense and temporality there at the top?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so pace and rhythm, the pace and rhythm of the voiceover. Much work was directed at kind of crafting the pace and rhythm. The image track would obviously be one determinant of the pace and rhythm of the piece as a whole. But the performance and the kind of audio editing of the narration would be another determinant there. Okay. And finally, a final kind of issue in terms of the writing of the voiceover, the process of writing performance and sound editing. So would I begin by writing a kind of finalized text and then perform it? Would I improvise in performance and then write the text and then re-perform it? And so on. How would these stages relate to each other? Okay, so I've talked quite a lot about the choices of the writing of the voiceover, of the relationship between image and sound. And the discussion, I don't think, has really kind of accounted for the film as a whole. In her article, The Concept of Cinematic Excess, an older article actually from 1977, Kristin Thompson discusses those elements that escape the unifying processes of a film. Yeah, those elements she calls the excess. If we as viewers cannot relate an element of the mise en scène, for example, to the patterns of narrative, the patterns of theme, the key kind of stylistic approaches of a piece, those elements can be regarded as excess. Excessive elements lack motivation. Their presence cannot be justified or understood in terms of a contribution to story, a contribution to theme or meaning, or a recurring kind of stylistic trait. Thompson notes, motivation is the primary tool by which the work makes its own devices seem reasonable. At that point where motivation fails, excess begins. For Thompson, a film will show a struggle as some elements resist the unifying patterns of narrative or meaning. And in my view, we can see that kind of struggle in Long Distance. The text and the performance of the voiceover, along with the sequences of images in chronological order, work to establish a particular narrative a set of meanings or themes around that narrative, and a set of recurring techniques. These constitute the unifying patterns of the film. And many images in the film contribute to, can be understood in relation to these patterns. The landscape images, for example, relate to the characterization of American society in the voiceover. However, there are elements of the film that cannot be subsumed into or contained by the patterns of narrative, meaning, and technique. And I would suggest that it's useful to understand these as excess in the way Thompson describes. She writes, narrative function may justify the presence of a device, but it doesn't always motivate the specific form that individual elements will take. Quite often, the device could vary considerably in form and still serve its function adequately. While the opening images of Long Distance in San Francisco serve to visualize the place where the lovers lived and where the train journey begins, and therefore have a basic narrative motivation, the particular forms of shape and light in some images are superfluous to the narrative, superfluous to the themes, and these become a kind of excess when they attract attention in themselves. The fact that the still images remain on screen for such a long period, sometimes outlasting their narrative or thematic justification, relates to Thompson's second category of excess. We may notice a device immediately and understand its function, but it may then continue to be visible or audible for some time past this recognition. In this case, we may be inclined to study or contemplate it apart from its narrative or compositional function. The creative choices behind the voiceover, which I've outlined, might be considered attempts to create consistency or coherence, which some elements of the film and elements of the image in particular resist. The voiceover seeks to constitute a narrative, a set of meanings or interpretations, and a point of view, which aspects of some images refuse or resist. In Long Distance, the look back at the camera and the questioning expression on the face of my ex-partner, which I think we see 2 or 3 times in the film. These are some of the strongest examples of excess. The look back towards us implies an optical point of view that literally has been absent from the piece, because the vast majority of the images are marked as representing my point of view as I hold the camera. The skeptical facial expression in the shot introduces an interpretation of events that is difficult to subsume within the narrative and meanings that the voiceover, really the film as a whole, have sought to establish. Kristin Thompson's examples come from Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, but documentary, which in many cases does not shape its mise en scène to the same extent as fiction, and in many cases does not seek to direct its participants' emotions, is surely more threatened by the appearance of cinematic excess than fiction film. Indeed, the substantial editing processes of many documentary films can be seen as an attempt to exclude the excessive elements that could trouble the unity of the film. And just to kind of finish off here, Thompson follows Roland Barthes and Stephen Heath in relating cinematic excess to the materiality of the medium. So they root cinematic excess in different ways in the materiality of the medium. The patterns of narrative or meaning created by a film are conceptual structures, but they require a material basis in the images and sounds that cue the viewer to perceive them. However, not every aspect of the images and sounds as material objects can be incorporated into these structures. The grain of the images in long distance is an aspect of their materiality that cannot be contained by the structures that the film seeks to establish, and the voiceover especially. The graininess becomes a source of interest for the viewer, particularly conspicuous in those images which are enlarged. The grain then stands outside of the unifying patterns of story or meaning as excess. So hopefully this paper has helped to establish, and I'll stop sharing there. Hopefully this paper has established some of the questions that I encountered in writing the voiceover, and hopefully established the idea of the creation of the voiceover as an attempt to kind of contain the excess of the film, which is not always kind of successful. Looking at it, viewing it, there's always something which is kind of outside of the voiceover's attempt to add meaning and narrative to it. So thank you, that's my presentation.